I'm going to start for the first 15 minutes and kind of give a bit of a primer on placemaking, how people define it, how people approach it, just so we're kind of all on the same level playing field, really, coming into this session. And I'm going to give an example of a really lovely placemaking project in action, which might be a useful sort of case study to come back to a bit. So let me just do the clunky thing of sharing my screen with you. And let's go. So yes, talking about cultural and creative placemaking, talking about it as a practice, um, and in a context as well. So the obvious question is, what is placemaking? And there's so many definitions out there. It's a relatively nascent field in and of itself, I guess, and lots of different descriptions there, people testing the waters with it a lot. How I see it and where I see it's absolute magic, and it's what really kind of made this a really sort of sticky practice for me, was its approach. Really, it's a really deeply participatory approach to shaping and reshaping the places that we are in, where we live, where we work, where we play, how we connect within those places as well. And it's very much a process as much as any material outcome as well. It should really always involve communities. That's something that makes placemaking different from other place-based disciplines. Um, it more often than not has a creative element going through it, and we'll come more to that later. And it has a wide cohort of stakeholders through the whole process anyway. But the idea being that you draw together this quite diverse group to really reflect local need, local identity, the ambitions, the aspirations of place as well. Now, this is a definition. This is quite a new definition. It's been around for probably actually no, for a couple of years, but it's one that really resonates with me because this is when I think about placemaking, when I do placemaking, when I see placemaking, this is what it is really. This is what I see. So placemaking is about strengthening the connections, physical, social, economic, and cultural between people in the places they share. It incorporates but goes beyond the creation of better public spaces and facilitates the civic activities that define a place and support its ability to thrive. So it says there's something about the real breadth and depth that I see when I'm talking about placemaking. Now, one of the reasons there's lots of definitions of placemaking is that it does happen across a wide spectrum. It can be really tactical at the grassroots level. It can go strategic across a whole region as well. Way back in the day, I did my PhD was looking at creative processes within placemaking. And I came up with this placemaking typology. Now, I wouldn't make this again like this. But I think what it does point to is the different horizontal and vertical levels at which placemaking operates. So you've got things that happen across a really big public realm. You've got creative placemaking, which has its own quite tight definition, really from the National Endowment for the Arts, their white paper that was done in 2013. Google that, you'll find it, and it's still really heavily referenced now. So you often see creative placemaking out there, sort of named as its own separate discipline. And then social practice side of this is so big on that particular thing because that's where I was looking at in my PhD. But there's seemingly, and I know I see Anna Kime from Centre for Cultural Value in the room, and they've done a fantastic research digest on placemaking. Who's saying what about placemaking? And I really would recommend you have a look at a read of that. It's fantastic. But I'm seeing as well, and I don't think it necessarily contradicts anything that that paper's saying, but some buckets of placemaking forming. So the term community-led placemaking, I'm seeing getting a lot of traction at the moment. That does what it says on the tin, really. Really anchored, driven by residents, grassroots organisations, really acting, advocating for changes in their place, temporary, permanent, but really going with those local aspirations and need. Creative placemaking, as I said, it's kind of been a standalone practice in a way for quite a while, but this is a really deeply embedded cultural and arts approach to placemaking. And creativity is that real golden thread that goes through all of it, as a practice, also as a means of inquiry into place as well. Strategic placemaking, this might be something, I mean, all of these can be strategic, of course, but as its own particular practice, this is really targeted onto something very specific within a place, particularly, sort of terms around quality places you might find associated with this. But whilst it is very targeted, it's quite sort of pinpointed. It, of course, through sort of this networked approach that placemaking can often take, it is linked to broader social, economic, and environmental goals as well. And then the term place shaping, this has come through from the Lyons paper, Lyons inquiry there, which is some time ago now. And the term has been floating around a lot, but I'm seeing a lot of traction with it at the moment when it's sort of the term place shaping, referring to policies that's happening that impact place. So not necessarily it'd be too reductive to say this is a totally top-down approach, but certainly it would be an approach that I'm seeing the term around a lot around devolution, around regional place-based initiatives as well. So this is sort of the overarching umbrella that shapes a place, and then perhaps placemaking being the more granular activity that happens on the ground. These aren't watertight. Of course, they're open to question, but there is some fluidity across all of these as well, and you'll have people involved across all of that, perhaps in one particular project at the same time. But to touch on what placemaking can do, and this is also one of the reasons why it's such a sticky practice for me, because it's by involving so many people and by being really community concerned and community led, it has some amazing outcomes and outputs to it. So absolutely around strengthening local identity, absolutely around encouraging that social connection between people as well. The economics going through placemaking are really quite exponential, and there's a number of papers out there that sort of back up that claim that there is a direct economic benefit to taking a place-based placemaking approach. And increasingly seeing an environmental concern go through in placemaking work as well. Particularly when you think of placemaking as a global practice, happening in places of the global south, happening in places that are under real sort of duress around climate and ecological breakdown. You're seeing placemaking approaches taking place there, but also more locally as well. A local project, that I'm involved in is around greening of a garden. So it can happen at the hyper-local level too. And then the benefits of taking this approach, and I saw this very much in my PhD, so this is something I've spoken about a lot. But there's absolutely that community cohesion and empowerment going through this. As a placemaker, I'm not somebody to give power to anybody, but certainly the sort of the coalescing, the confluence of all of these different stakeholders coming together, and the community being there front and central of all of that is a massively empowering process for people, and they can see the direct impact of their thoughts and their actions in a place as well. Economic and cultural growth, which we've touched on as well, but definitely boosting local economies. And there's a lot there around it attracting investment, good or bad, depending on where we're at. That's not an uncontentious issue either. Certainly an approach and a benefit to health and well-being. There's often going along hand in hand with placemaking increased access to culture, more time outdoors, physical health benefits, and so on. And there's certainly something here around sustainability and resilience. I have a bit of a relationship with that word resilience. I don't necessarily like it. But you're certainly seeing within this a real cohesion of group identity. And when you think of some of the places where, there's a bit of a tripartite of placemaking, gentrification, and regeneration, and certainly there, placemaking approaches are really galvanizing a sense of identity. that is, within those particular places. So thinking now of the role of culture and creativity in placemaking, the image here actually is from Yeovil Art Space, a group that I'm working with at the moment, and they're doing fantastic placemaking work in Yeovil and really transforming that town centre. And there are various different relationships and economic relationships within the town centre as well. So I really suggest you have a look at them. But I'm not going to read all of the next slide, and I can certainly share my slides with you after this. But the role of culture in placemaking, here we go. This was my, when I was coming up with the, what could go in here. There's a lot. There's a lot that the role of culture in placemaking. And actually the image here as well is from the Stove Network, a group that work on the borders. And again, I would signpost you to them as a real example of best practice, and they have a fantastic set of resources and toolkits around placemaking and working with communities. But it does all of these things incredibly well. There's some very obvious things there about supporting local identity and heritage, about making public spaces more inclusive and accessible. There's a lot of the work here that does it bridge intergenerational cross-cultural boundaries as well. And there is this sense of community well-being and health, but it's this to me also goes to the breadth and depth of placemaking at the same time. It's a very, very broad church. It's a wide benefit impact of what happened within a placemaking project. And this is just a summation of it. This isn't necessarily an exhaustive list either. And I want to give you now an example of a placemaking project that's happening locally. It's one that I've been working with and it's local to me. And it has an impact at the hyper-local level, and it's having an impact at the policy level within our county as well. And an example that's happening in Newhaven. So this is Newhaven. It's a town of around 13,000 people. It's situated between Brighton and Eastbourne. It has a ferry, and you can see the ferry terminal there. And it has, you can see in the top of the screen, it has an incinerator. And what it has going through that town are the roads that support both. All the traffic going to the ferry and the container port, and then all the traffic going to the incinerator. So these are really heavy trunk roads going right the way through that town. And it's been like that for a very long time. The ferry goes off to Dieppe, so it's really busy. So it's a really traffic heavy town. But it's also a town within Sussex. You're never going to see Newhaven on the Visit Sussex website, for example. I might be being unfair there, but this is, the impression, the reputation that goes before Newhaven, is that it's a very dated town, it's a very poor town, economically, and it's a bit of a blot on the landscape. And it has those, it sits on various indices that you would look at to understand a town, and it sits at the high and low levels, of a lot of that. And so notionally, that was seen to back up that reputation, that impression. But of course, that isn't the only story to Newhaven, and I'm going to share with you a real life example now also of what somebody in the planning team put out as a test run for their new planning online infrastructure, but unfortunately it went live. It's a planning application test, building something nasty nobody likes in Newhaven, and this did go live by mistake. And it says it all really, that, the perception that Newhaven is a place to dump on, that the Newhaven residents are always going to be complaining, and that the town really isn't worth caring about. It was the sort of the butt of this, at the time, thought in joke. And this treatment of the town is at the root cause of a lot of distrust between the residents of the town and the council. and it talks also to real structural and systemic impact over generations of this been happening to this in New Haven. And there's something here of a sort of, some micro traumas happening in this has been so systemic over the years. And of course, within this, planning consultations have been happening in New Haven for years and years and years. And they've been consultations that the town have felt have been very extractive. Somebody will come along, ask them what they think and feel, they'll take that information away, and lo and behold, the money that was mooted at some point never really materialises, it disappears, and the process repeats on and on and on. But there's a real opportunity coming towards New Haven now with some local money and not in substantial amounts. And this is all around how the town centre looks and functions. This is classic placemaking opportunity here. And this is Lizzie and Ellie from Hospitable Environment. They're a socially engaged art group based in New Haven. They're New Haven residents as well. And they're doing a lot to really galvanise a really constructive conversation around what is happening in New Haven and the opportunities coming down the line to the town. They're both artists, and they've been taking that creative approach, that really creative agency aware approach to working with residents in New Haven to have these conversations around development, knowing that these conversations be had a different way. So out with consultation boards in a church hall type approach, and in with a social conversation. This happens over a bowl of soup, and it happens where the town comes together to talk about who they are, to talk about their ambitions for the place, what their needs and their wants are as well. And this has been happening over a sustained period of years now. And the initial project was funded by something else I'm involved in, Sussex CoLab, which is another sort of placemaking initiative that's harnessing a lot of what this energy is happening where I am in Sussex, in Brighton. And another member of the Sussex CoLab group said this, which I think is a little bit of genius. You don't get answers by asking questions, you get answers by having conversations. And that's exactly the approach that's happening in New Haven, these really sustained conversations. So this is what Hospitable Environment have been doing with the community, but now increasingly with the town councillors and planners in the room too. They've created a space there that isn't confrontational, where the town planners and different councillors feel welcome in the space, and actually there's a certain equality in the space. And they've done something there to help them realise actually that we're all neighbours of each other here. My needs and aspirations aren't necessarily that different from anybody else's. And so sort of parity across there and an equal stakeholdership. And this is all happening in this wonderful social encounter that a placemaking approach can take as well. It's never a linear journey. And at every step of the way, Lizzie and Ellie are responding, adapting, generating new, being really responsive to what's happening in the moment. But there is a step change happening in this town, really stemming from this sustained and very embedded placemaking approach that Hospitable Environment have taken. If you ever get a chance to go to one of their soup and socials, I recommend you do it, because they are also very just joyous experiences to be part of as well. But I guess what this all comes to, and this is something that's a real interest of mine, and it's what always keeps me coming back to placemaking, is around this notion of community power in place-based decision making. So really at its core, placemaking is about this community agency, ensuring that those that live in a place, that work in that place, that use that place, have a really meaningful role in shaping its future. And so placemaking, by centering the community, by having really diverse stakeholders around a table, people that wouldn't normally be in conversation with one another, this is when it really comes into its fore. I'm talking about that in a slightly idealized way, like this is what should happen. It isn't always possible, it isn't always done, but it is done a lot. It does happen a lot. And so when you take this really holistic approach to place, that's when placemaking really comes into its own. And giving some consideration to this, I was thinking, and we can talk about this further, but sort of 8 ways that this happens. So around decision-making structures, resource allocation and funding, accountability and transparency, capacity building and skills development. That's a lot of what's been happening in New Haven as well, actually. There's networks and collaborations that come out of a placemaking approach. Local knowledge is really foregrounded as the expertise in the room. There's a lot of flexibility and adaptability to something. And you really do see an impact on community and really on their terms as well. So this is where placemaking, and this is leading into now Nicola's part of this conversation, where placemaking really comes up and into place policy. Community, bringing a community agency into the policy life cycle. And I think there's a potential for this when it comes to devolution, not just in how we talk about devolution, but whatever comes out at the other end of these next couple of years as well. Because devolution is talking, it is not just about power being devolved either. Power needs to be distributed and shared, co-designed with communities in its process as well. And really ensuring that communities aren't just consulted, but are really sort of lead in making decisions in very meaningful ways. That's where I'm going to leave it for now. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll hand over to Nicola to pick up the baton.
Is it possible I can see all the participants on one, if Cara is not sharing, is there a way of doing that? Hang on, I just want to see everyone. Ah, there we are, grid video. Hello. Well, that was incredibly comprehensive, as you'd expect from Cara Courage. So I'm coming almost from, in some ways, the opposite end of the telescope, because despite having a community development background and a sort of culture and placemaking and shaping background, I found myself in a lot of rooms from the 90s onwards with people saying things like culture is the rocket fuel of regeneration. What are the essentially a lot of astroturfing of real estate projects, of property development, and a kind of smearing of the kind of language of participation that Cara means very sincerely over some really quite appalling, very extractive, resource intensive bits of change, economic change. And again, that famous line, whenever I hear anybody mention culture, I reach for my revolver. I'm not saying that because strong men are back in fashion, we should start following years of Stalin, but there is something about the power of who gets to say, who gets to memorialize what is literally what's noticed. I was thinking that was so interesting, Cara, when you're doing that New Haven case, because I'm very unusually, I'm in Kent rather than Manchester, where I normally live. And there is this something about the power of the tourist gaze in the coastal areas of Kent. So my sister lives at Whitstable, just down the coast, and there is a massive cement works. And there is almost like a collective agreement that nobody ever mentions it. It's literally enormous. It sits on the coast, and it's like you can see people, you frame your experience of Whitstable with the cement thing completely adjacent, right? So Whitstable, then you're able to then construct the place along the lines that the thing isn't really there. And Whitstable is again, it's a incredibly desirable seaside town. It has all the resource use challenges that Cara mentions. about transport and all the rest of it. But I was just thinking how interesting it is that in a place which is sort of a bit, you focus only on the problems, but somehow a strong place brand, such as Whitstable, you sort of screen them out, literally in terms of the tourist gaze, in terms of the brochure, the dreaded, council brochure for the place, all that kind of stuff. So that's the first thing I just wanted to connect. So there's something about official and secret and identity-based and private versions of place, which is incredibly interesting. And then I guess my work's always been about the governance of economic development. So it's then, how are those things then mobilized and used as capital? So, I know you're very aware of Commonwealth Games Fund in the city region. I've been doing work recently with Bradford, mobilizing capital of culture work. There is a real place where the kind of practices that Cara was just describing and the craft of designing governance scales and identities kind of come together. And so at a regional innovation system level, so a city regional level, look like the one that you're being convened at today, there's a sort of salience and there's a who gets to say element, which is always very interesting. And of course, a change of government means that we all take a seat along in the language game, the roundabout of policy. We are seeing towns are out, place is back in, neighbourhoods are back in, and area is a little bit out. And what's fascinating about that policy language game and that scale shifting is that one thing that in terms of both a city regional and a neighbourhood level, these are softer scales of governance than, for example, a local government convening level, or indeed a national level. And just as a slight aside, back to geopolitics and strong men, even supranational levels of governance are softer and weaker than national. So we're seeing so it's always a stack, right? You start literally at the neighbourhood, which could be a parade of shops, could be a park, could be a cafe, could be anything. And then on top of that, you have the political structures, wards, representation into the local government, constituencies, and connection to national government. But the soft scales kind of connect in fascinating ways. So as everybody will know, there's so much practice from UK Capital of Culture that filters into the city regional level and to neighbourhoods, and it never touches either the central local, which are the mandated governance scales that we understand better. And this is a great opportunity for tactical work of the kind that Cara describes. In my experience, European level working, so the supranational is incredibly fecund and interesting. The city region is still up for grabs in terms of its settling its view on place and identity and those kinds of things. And the neighbourhood, as we saw beautifully in the New Haven example. So my advice is always act very tactically, and the only way anything ever happens in the world, in my view, is by people animating and gathering the scope at whatever scale is salient at the time and putting it into drive. So scope at scale can be hyper-local. It can be city regional if you're kind of lucky and you get the wind behind you, and a small coalition of people are then able to notice and see and act with the artifacts that we were talking about in that first process, is social processes. So the other thing that's very interesting about a place approach is how much of government policy is coming at you place blind, and not just government policy. Why is or isn't there a bank on your high street is to do with a whole set of decisions. So, okay, brilliant example. Bradford having its City of Culture moment, having its kind of excitement. Bloody Marks and Spencers looked at their map of which stores were profitable last year, pulled out of Bradford and have left a big space. And we were furious because it was like, okay, you're not showing a lot of support we understand you've got money to make, but could you not have shone it on slightly just to give the sense that it was a flagship store in a new shopping arcade, but their numbers said, place blind decision, cut is here, off we go. And, so it was really annoying that and they'd been partners in bids and things previously, but it just demonstrated that their place commitment to Bradford was a fingernail deep when it actually came to it, because their actual commitment was, the spreadsheet came and said, and we've all seen those decisions that are taken, which cumulatively you end up with place. It's sort of a slightly residual category, but it's where everything happens. So yes, there was just a piece this morning that I just put on my LinkedIn. What is the biggest problem in our place? It's high streets, of course, shops closing. Well, the decision to move out of Newhaven High Street or Herne Bay High Street or anywhere else could be taken in a place blind fashion, and the experience of withdrawal and abandonment and all of those things is felt in that place. So that's another thing. So having said that, quite a lot of this kind of language and work can be just astroturfing and culture washing over a very well thumbed property playbook. You have to be alert at all times to those kinds of things. And the scope at scale point, which again, I hope I explained, it's about when, things happen when people are able to animate at a specific scale. And I find the spaces between the formal local government and central government have the most potential for disruption and for disturbing practice, changing the gaze, changing what's noticed, changing what's valued. And that's just my experience. But everybody that's working in a place forward fashion, and everybody that's working in culture, are scale shifters. Different scales are salient at different times and for different audiences. And it's about pulling the know-how and the know-who together. I love the slide from Cara's example of, we did some work, going back, SRB 3 in Oxford. So we're talking, early, mid-90s. And it was all about a major artery in East Oxford, Cowley Road. And it was about how it could be turned from a very sort of straightforward arterial road into shared use. So cyclists, pedestrians, how are we going to get there? And in some ways, the most lasting legacy of that project, it is still quite a busy A road, I mean, this is the facts of life, was having mapped in a cartoonish fashion every step on the route to a decision about something as regulated and as clear as the highways process. So to get to a shared space, to drop the curbs and all of that. And so in some ways, and this is back to the governance of place, is kind of always with us. The minute that we are trying to disrupt, trying to engage, trying to animate a slightly different role for either land use or for place, the extemporizing and explaining what are the processes to get to a decision in some ways falls to creative people to explain and to codify the kind of rules in use of why things happen the way that they do. So I have a bunch of things that I am very passionate about. One is that you go worst first. You go to the place that has the most need first. Another is that you are clear about intervention at the very local level, and you construct it in the way that Cara described. It takes a multi-helix approach, even at the single parade or single park level. You need research, industry, government, and communities on board to make things happen. You pull that scope at scale together, animate and deploy. And I couldn't agree more about the thing about placemaking under duress. So yes, either climate, or there was a thing shared this morning about the ways of doing creative governance in Ukraine. Obviously, those municipalities under the most stress you can be under, but in some places, taking a creative approach to redesigning their governance as a response to the extreme stress that they're under. So I think, yes, and so in some ways, just want to leave you with, obviously we're talking about networks and we're talking about partnerships, and these can be as ephemeral or as substantial as it's a long continuum. But one of the things that I know always works is established networks that kind of come together and fall apart around specific issues or places. But the lovely quote from Rainer Maria Rilke, let there be spaces in your togetherness. It's always about there being enough of a gap in a network for innovation to crowd in, for ideas not to be too tightly controlled. So you're connected, but you're loosely connected. I think that was what I wanted to say this morning. If that gave enough ways in for questions, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Cara and Nick. Absolutely, really insightful. We have one question already in the chat, which is, what is the difference between cultural placemaking and creative placemaking? But just before I hand over to that one, and we've got loads of new people in the room, and so it'd be really good to see who's here by just pumping your name and an organisation if you are affiliated to an organisation just in the chat, so we can get a sense of who's in the room. That would be brilliant as well. So I'll hand over that question to Cara and Nick first. So what's the difference between cultural placemaking and creative placemaking?
Very simple answer: whatever the government says is at any given moment.
Yeah,
it's a language game.
Nicola's not wrong in that. Technically, creative placemaking, there is, I mentioned it, the National Endowment for the Arts and Estates did a creative placemaking paper in 2013. And that has put in it, and it's on page 3 of the exec summary. It's not necessarily a definition, but an understanding of this term creative placemaking. It came from that particular funder recognizing that they were getting a lot more applications that were concerned with place and wanting to understand it. And the term creative placemaking came about then. I saw then that sort of the term cultural placemaking start to get a bit of airspace, probably 7, 8 years ago. And to me, it seemed a bit like, actually, you're doing the same thing here. And it seemed like a bit of a backlash to, like, we just want to use a different term just for the sake of novelty. I have seen some sort of more cultural placemaking strategies that take a much more broader understanding, wrapping in, a wider scope than perhaps a creative placemaking would if you look at the definition. But honestly, it's paper thin between the two in reality. And yeah, it depends on its use is the whim of the policy writer, the flavour of the government at the time. It's not to say it's interchangeable, but it's certainly utilised in that way.
And again, like just in the same way that scale skips all over the place, never underestimate the craving for novelty of these terms. I mean, it was perfectly possible for people to say, oh, we've done a placemaking approach. What's next in a way, which is why, as I say, localism, which was rooted in sort of quite selective who gets to say processes, is giving way again to, as Cara said, a more thoroughgoing kind of devolution. But I think if you're in a meeting and it's called creative placemaking, all that Cara said is still valid. It's just that there's a different nuance being kind of brought to bear. I don't know if anyone else has got a clearer. My experience would be that there would be a lot of similarity. Ooh, what level of public money has been needed for placemaking projects mentioned so far? Resource, Cara, go on.
What level of public money has been needed? Oh my gosh, how long is a piece of string? I've seen placemaking projects like Hospitable Environment run on £2,000 a year and create benefit far and wide and deep. And I've also been involved in projects that have had £26 million budgets, and certainly have an impact as well. I don't, the part of me that comes from the arts sector, artists, creators are very good at sort of almost spending every pound twice. So I'd always advocate for more budget earlier on. But I don't think there's a sort of handy sort of matrix or something that you can point at. Project of this scale, this number of people, whatever, it's going to be that amount of money. And where the funding comes will be very different. The mix of public and private through it. But how that particular pie is sort of sliced up will be different for every project as well.
It may be, rather than a project level answer, so reliable sources of money that can be used for this kind of work can be found in the planning system, but you do need some know who and know how to extract that value. Of course, Arts Council funded organisations and AHRC funded academics. They've got different sort of notions of how much it's going to cost to talk to 6 people, because obviously an academic is going to take £900 million to deal with 3 members of the community, I would think. But as you say, like, sorry, I'm just teasing, but the way that research bids are constructed can make things look very expensive through universities. Of course, third sector, individual practitioners, it might be completely natural to them to do. We can talk about planning fund. I'll give you some details. And also, of course, if and when your area has got a major cultural focus, and again, arguably because you have the Culture Central as your cultural agency, they will be working all the time on your behalf to funnel money towards you. And in some ways, the most sort of doing God's work in the current context is you take a wide funnel of what you can grab and you take it as close to the grassroots as you can. And that is a skill set in itself, and involves, dark arts, etc. So there are those of us in the system that work in that way. But yeah, exactly. A capital of culture, could be is 50. Bradford is spending 53 million on the cultural offer. So pulling the all the wider and longer and deeper benefits for that city becomes a kind of exactly that. It's a filter to concentrate activity. But it's we've all seen projects that, and the other thing is that the main thing in planning is the notion in the planning, certainly the old planning guidance, is very much like, I'm going to build 19 houses and a piece of public art. So like the Bee of the Bang in East Manchester, which was very famous, a sort of filament, extremely dangerous and removed kind of at short order. And it takes some quite clever bid writing and partnerships to transform that into the kind of sustainable process that Cara is talking about. So like a festival, or like a set of facilitation around a place would be so much more useful than a kind of snazzy public art intervention. It might end up in a public art intervention, but it's about that sort of capital revenue switcheroo, and it's always possible. It's always possible to be creative about the money, even in contexts that don't feel that creative.
A lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is increasingly public health is where the real genuine interest lies, in taking a place-based approach, and still compromise, but different budgets there. In the past, I've had a lot from transit in working with local government levels as well. There's been that budget. There's a question there about who's got that know-how reaccessing planning funds. There are those that sort of know the dark arts of it, and I've learned a lot along the way. I wasn't ever trained in this, but you learn on the spot. But what you said there, Nicola, as well, I think the strength of a place-based approach, by working with a real cross-section of who is involved in place, is that you become aware of different pots of money. So I will know the arts and heritage culture side of funding like the back of my hand. And I know certain different avenues going in through a local government level. Working with another partner who might come from a marine science background, they have a totally different pot of, purview on the funding realm. And it is that partnership approach, and it is pooling all of your knowledge around how to get money together that is getting the success of this. So this sort of the health ecology of partnerships in this kind of work is ever important.
And again, academics can be incredibly useful, because if it falls right, then you can, they can, I don't know if anybody has had experience of using university funds to sort of catalyze this kind of work, but again, you can So I was thinking NERC funding, you're absolutely right, Cara, like, quite unusual funding streams are often interested in this form of practice. And it's rather than just, a diagram that says Arts Council in, AHRC in, there are, it's a kind of craft in itself, actually, crafting the platform and the long range infrastructure. But am I right? Is that something that Culture Central are sort of do signpost people towards, how to come together in that way? Yeah, Birmingham City Council have been using EZ funding, absolutely. Enterprise zone funding, business improvement district funding. It's about being visible and saying what you need and having a community process in your back pocket as part of your kind of co-produced action plan. People will find money because they want to be associated with that if it's a genuine thing. So yeah. Thanks, David. That's helpful.
Thanks, Nick, for giving us suggestions on more things we should be doing. But no, it's really interesting. We do convene the cultural compacts, which, actually thinking about it, the cultural compacts are kind of that cross-sector network, which are about kind of thinking about strategy and where investment goes in place. And it's a very strong network here in the West Midlands, actually.
I think as well, sort of research, that's coming out about how compacts are successful is exactly when you get that different group of people around a table, which was its whole point in case, wasn't it? But when you take that place-based approach, and those that have really succeeded have really understood what that means and have really pulled on their own resources, a greater than the sum of parts model classically, to really begin to make some change there. And they've really enjoyed those conversations as well and working differently. And again, universities had a big part in that too.
I mean, certainly, and again, back to Capital of Culture work, the ways in which universities interface with sort of the big cultural infrastructure when it comes is fascinating. But absolutely right. Somebody said planning gain is more normally for associated infrastructure, but both 106 and sometimes if you have precepts and things like that, it can be very profitably. Again, if you are doing work that is useful and real and embedded, then a creative planner in a local authority will remember you at the point at which the check comes from the developer. Obviously, the developer has got their own objective, which is feasibility and not supporting possibly, but it's having as broad a network and having spaces in your togetherness is going to give you a much more diversified sort of fundraising structure for the work that you want to do. Particularly successful compacts is completely out of my world.
There's BOP did a lot of research on this, so they've got quite there's two kind of big reports that came out of BOP around that. I did a paper last year or the year before for NCASE, which is around universities' roles in compacts as well. And there's quite a long resource list at the back of that paper for various different resources that I was using at the time. I haven't kept up with it since, I'll be perfectly honest, but that could be a starting place, looking at that reading list. I'll get the link for that and put it in the chat.
Question from David Firmage. A big thing at Birmingham is how we seed fund a local vision and then scale and find follow-on funding. Any thoughts on follow-on funding and scaling up? So what I'm hearing, everybody, is that David will help you get going. The question is, what next? And it's a great question, because just as in some ways community projects need to have the same sort of mentality as startups in terms of ideas. One thing that we do not lack is ideas at the front end. One thing that we do lack then is getting to scale. It's a common problem. So innovation and the surfeit of kind of ideas, it is much more about the know-how and the know-who in locality to work out. And it's things like business case, it's things like, is there Are there products that can be developed? Is there a space that's developed? Is a CIC a potential? You're looking then to take something to have a life, a kind of commercial kind of market life, and that's where you need dedicated staff. Really, that's the kind of thing, and that's been very hard to get mobilized, because essentially, again, Culture Central is an agency which is in order to do this kind of connective work, but at the neighborhood level, it's been very problematic to keep people funded that are those kind of pollinators and cross-pollinators. Certainly since and as I say, localism itself was very much a bid culture, neighborhood kind of. Say if we are, inshallah, coming back to a worst first scenario, then so certainly in the olden days of sort of strong neighborhood work, there would be coordinators and infrastructure in the most deprived neighborhoods, and that would serve, yes, public health and social behavior planning. But that's partly about, after austerity, place-based working is denuded in lots of ways, whereas having a kind of loose but functioning network within neighborhoods, I don't know if that's what people are experiencing now. It's quite difficult.
In a way, there though, Anna, the example that you've put in of Hastings Commons, it's fantastic, and run from a relatively small team, doing a lot of really great work. So I would absolutely flag that one as one for people to look at.
And exactly that local cultural education partnership, very
Yeah.
good. It's almost like Anthony knows his business, isn't it?
That's really, really interesting. Just to, I suppose, to flag as well a couple of examples that we know in terms of cultural compacts and how that strategy about driving investment in Stoke, for example, their cultural compact Stoke creates has levered investment for themselves, but also their shared prosperity fund that was awarded to Stoke as a priority place, I think around about £4 million went to cultural projects and programmes, and I think that was about how you influence the strategy with that partnership model. Sheffield is another example where it's a very different space in terms of compacts, where you've got property developers who actually put money into a fund for culture, which is then matched or kind of supported in different ways as well. So there are some interesting ways, and I think, like I say, it's about appropriate to place and who's bringing and convening those people together. Lots of resource in the chat, which is fantastic. Also, where we've got about 5 or 6 minutes. Is there any more questions from anybody? And I've got 2 screens of people. So if rather than waving that hand, wave the virtual hand. Or
whilst people are thinking of questions as well, just to come back to that point about investment and where people have got it from. We talk about Stoke quite a lot, but actually that's been decades, if not longer, in the making. There have been really almost like quite small scale interventions that happen there that have led up to, through creative partnerships, then through creative people and places, through bidding for different pieces of work, the relationship with the city council, that have really led that work as well. And it's taken a long time to do as well.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm being flippant about how quickly these things happen. Quite on the contrary, these are, it's about you're animating for generations, with really long-term principles, but it's more about the enabling the work to either get going or to scale. It's where you need that kind of entrepreneurial set of skills to, just to put a bit more juice in the tank, We're kind of all entrepreneurs now in terms of our ready to take those opportunities. Very good, Anthony. Anybody we've not heard from that has a burning question?
Or comment is fine too.
Yeah, comment. You can say my earrings are nice.
Your earrings are nice, Nick. Oh, I've got a hand up. There we go. David.
Hi all. Hi there, David Furmage from Birmingham City Council. Just quickly, I thought I'd say that obviously we're the times are changing rapidly, aren't they? And here with a single settlement, with obviously funding being redirected from government and a lot going via the combined authority, means we're sort of restructuring how we're working between planning, neighbourhoods, communities, culture.
Yeah.
So it's an ongoing thing, but we are really trying to work together closely, because I think whilst you divided your areas between sort of community, creative and others, really it's one blurred overlapping Venn diagram, isn't it, with all of these things working together. So I just want to say I think it's a very changing landscape of how funding will work going forward. So
and of course moving towards more single pots.
Yeah.
This is why I mean, like I feel like I might have had my Weetabix this morning, because I feel like those are changes that are in order to facilitate what we're talking about. It's just that, you know, it feels like, as I say, localism, which was pretty divisive. So it's about a collaborative kind of set of infrastructures going forwards. And you're very lucky in the West Midlands because you've got, so, you know, this isn't a Manchester Birmingham problem. You have got mature city regional relationships, which, yes, change a lot, but there is a real strength to leveraging at city regional level, and particularly because the West Midlands it has Pathfinder. If you can be visible and be engaged in those circuits, as I know Culture Central are, there is quite a lot to play for, I think, in the medium term in the West Midlands.
Absolutely.
And here's a question then. And so do you think, Nick, Cara, if in terms of that funding, that sort of the change to devolution will make it more clear as to where and how you access those funds? You know, obviously I'm just thinking about the West Midlands. We have the combined authority, but we also have a lot of unitary authorities, also a lot of two-tier authorities around sort of Worcestershire, Herefordshire, who were, you know, it's quite uncertain at the moment.
Yeah.
But that makes it also currently quite difficult to navigate the kind of fund landscapes and all of the different places and the priorities. Just be interesting to think whether you think those future plans would actually make that clearer.
Well, so number one, never wait. Don't wait for it to become clear. And number two, if there is flux, then people, you know, policymakers dislike a vacuum. So if you can, so your prospectus of what Culture Central does, that to me feels incredibly strong for the rallying cry to be like, these are the things that we do. Do you want in? Because as we've said, you know, the language game of policy, like there isn't a grand poobah in the sky who's going to give you a template for culture in your area. They may receive one with more interest than they have before. Do you see what I mean? It's the other way around. It's never going to make sense. It's never going to be great. Take the opportunities and create the networks in the flux and benefit from the confusion and lead.
That's exactly what I've been saying to some communities that I'm working with as well. And they, with their particular mix of counties and unitaries, and they have a real fear, especially some of the smaller places, that are going to get left behind. And it's, you know, it's like it's hard enough for us to advocate for ourselves at the moment as it is, and we're going to get left behind. And it's like, actually, there is an opportunity here just to really be setting your own direction and your own agenda with this. Because we don't necessarily know what's going to come out the other side of these conversations of devolution. So you get in those conversations and begin to take that place leadership, because I think people are also quite genuinely interested in how people are doing things and how they're approaching things. And there's also, we're doing some work locally actually to really capture where people are now. You know, we know a lot of this stuff already. Devolution is a different framing of it, but we know it already. So we're probably further ahead in this than we might actually realise. So I'm convening conversations at the moment just to really surface what we do know through that lens of devolution, to see exactly where that flux, those sweet spots, all of those things that you mentioned, Nick, are. Who the particular key players are in in any region, that's going to come out in the wash, isn't it? But there is an opportunity at the moment now to really step in.
And also, even if there isn't an overt sort of cultural line in a plan or whatever, the place branding piece is huge, because the point of devolution is to have place-based leadership. And it doesn't matter if it's the Northern Powerhouse or Kent. It's that those things exist through a brand, and it's sorry, we're going on now. Thank you, Stan's Cafe. I liked your bear. I think, to be honest, this has been so stimulating and so interesting. Maybe there's somewhere we can follow up, Anthony. We do something else, because I'm conscious that some people have been nodding but not contributing much. So if you'd like to speak to us again, or if there's something else, more specifics, we'd be really happy to talk about that. And yes, Anthony's showing you that Culture Summit priorities and principles. Nobody's going to take that document and go, nah, the cultural priorities for the region are really this, because nobody's done that work. So, it's partly you mobilize that as a kind of document within which you can find spaces within your togetherness and be more than the sum of your parts. And as I say, just lead together.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Cara. Thank you, both of you, for absolutely brilliant crew session this morning. Thank you to everyone who has attended. I'd normally do a bit of a Culture Central update, but we're running out of time. So all I'm going to say is, if you haven't already, sign up to our newsletter, and we'll have all of the next crew sessions advertised in there very shortly. We're also renewing membership from April, just everybody. So you can also join Culture Central as a membership organisation, which then, supports us to get our investment from Arts Council, which fund sessions like the crew and our collective leadership programme and mentoring. So thanks, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your week. See you soon.
Thank you, everybody. See you soon.